Sorry, I had to. Um,
Cool.
Morning and welcome to spooky season at Avero. We are kicking off our marketing efforts around Halloween and just the month of October with our Where the Bodies Are Buried promotion. Essentially, what that means is, as third-party independent consultants, we can help you find where the bodies are buried, where your software vendors may not tell you the whole truth. So, to promote that theme, we have spooky Mr. Eric Kimberling, one of the finest voices in ERP consulting and independent digital transformation around the world, and a good friend of the firm's and mine. Eric, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's good to see you guys.
Same here. We did Stratosphere last week together, and it was a huge success. Had a great time. Just meeting the high caliber of people you guys got together in the same room was phenomenal. So let me start off by telling the audience about who we are. This is Avera Advisors. We are an independent third-party consulting firm that specializes in the public sector. We help our clients modernize their operations and promote change. Eric?
Hi, I'm Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and our company description sounds fairly similar to yours, or moderately similar to yours. We're independent and tech agnostic as well. Although we work with a number of different industries, we're sort of industry agnostic as well. So good to be here today. Thanks for having me.
And Eric just has had a book published on this topic on how to get to the third stage of digital transformation. And I think a big part of your book, Eric, is change management.
It
And
is.
we've called this episode the Ghosts of Resistance because we talk about technology all day, what systems better for you, what business processes need to change, but always lurking in the background is the ghosts of resistance.
hmm
What are your experiences, and how important do you think change management is in tackling even the smallest of digital transformations?
Well, I'd say first of all, the ghost of resistance is a good way to put it because it's
Yeah.
it's hard to spot, it's hard to see. Sometimes you don't see it at all when we're referring to resistance to change, and resistance is oftentimes below the surface. So,
Mhm.
as executives, a lot of times what happens is executive teams will say, "Our team is really excited about this change." I mean, they don't like their old crappy systems. They're ready for new technology. They want the company to be better and be more, or the organization to be more successful, which is true usually on the surface. But then once you start disrupting someone's world by taking away roles and responsibilities or changing the way they do their jobs, then it becomes more of a threat. And even the best intended people are going to resist change in some way, in most cases.
And a lot of times it's unseen, right? What do you think some signs of resistance that may be small at present, but as the implementation or assessment progresses, what are some things to look out for that are unseen to the people that do these jobs day in and day out, but you and I can spot them? What do you think they are?
Well, I think a lot of times, we tend to want to look at like the behavior on the surface. Like I look at you, AV, and you look like you're happy, you look like you're supportive, so
Yeah.
I'm going to assume you're supportive. And like I said, usually that's true. That's the intent of people. But what you have to look for is, rather than looking at what you see on the surface in terms of people's behavior, you have to sort of look at the situation and understand the situations that most likely cause resistance. So, for example, if you have employees on your team that are highly manual processes, or their work is highly manual, they're doing a lot of stuff in spreadsheets. They've got all this tribal knowledge in their head. They've got the processes all figured out in their head. Those are oftentimes your most valuable people, and the ones you're more likely to assume are going to be totally supportive of the change because they're such um, they're so instrumental to the organization. But what ends up happening is when those people that have really highly manual processes, or they've created their own special spreadsheet that they use to manage a process or whatever, when you start talking about disrupting that or taking that away, those are the people that are most likely to resist change. And again, these are the people that you're more likely to assume are going to be fine with the change. They're on board. They say that they support the project. They're acting like they support the project. They probably are supporting the project. But when you start talking about changing them and their
Mhm.
world, and taking away their spreadsheet and automating their job and centralizing the knowledge that they have in their head, suddenly the heroics that have made them successful in the organization is at risk, at least in their minds.
Yeah.
You have to look at the situation and understand that any human is likely to be threatened by that, no matter how talented or well intended they are. They just are going to be threatened by that. So I think that's one of the key things, is just looking at like the situation of what their reality is, not necessarily what they're saying on the surface.
Hmm. And in my experience, many times these same people become the biggest champions of your project.
Yeah.
And there's some inflection point, something clicks, and I would claim that it has to do with us consultants. Um, but I think it comes down to when you show them how their life's going to change for the better, or also equate that to the legacy they're creating. Because a lot of times, people that, at least in my world, they're about to retire, they have 3 years to go. Why are you making me do this now? Those also tend to be um, people that resist change because they don't want to go through this, or they've gone through an ERP implementation 2 years ago, and here we are again because we failed the last time. Those aren't quite ghostly or in the background; they're quite out there.
Yeah.
What strategies have you found, Eric, to overcome that kind of resistance? Because if you don't have buy-in from the rank and file, like we talked about in our debate, uh, you have only executive support. It doesn't work. How do you get over the line workers and their resistance, which may not be visible, right? They're doing it because the executives are telling them to do.
Yeah. Yeah. You have a good point in what you said about them becoming the people that resist the change oftentimes can end up becoming your biggest champions. And that's a really good point that's worth sort of underscoring, because
Sure. Yeah.
as consultants, as change practitioners, as project team members and leaders in an organization, we want to try and flip those people as fast as we can. As soon as we can flip them into champions, and recognize the reality of the fact they are going to resist the change. So how do we flip them instead of assuming they're already flipped or they're already on board fully with the change? So I think that's something that's worth noting. But I think that you mentioned executive buy-in, and I think that's where it starts. You have to have executives that are not only bought in terms of what they say, in terms of saying that they approve the project and saying that they're on board with the project and supportive of it, but rather, day to day, are they involved in the project? Are they making key decisions? Are they rolling up their sleeves and sort of defining that future state vision for the organization and creating that clarity? A lot of times when there's lack of clarity and there's uncertainty, that's what creates the resistance to change. It's not that the change itself is bad necessarily. It's that the change is misunderstood or not understood at all by the team. So I think that clarity, executive vision, and executive alignment and support, it all starts there. And then there's, of course, other change tactics and strategies that you can use to get more people on board and to flip those resistors and turn them into champions.
Yeah. How important do you
So,
think? Sorry, Megan.
no,
We're
you're
on.
fine. You're fine, guys. AV's taking over my job a little bit today because I lost my voice because I'm talking too much. So, but I do have a good question for you, Eric, if you don't mind me just butting in here.
Sure.
How do you differentiate between legitimate concerns about change and just the resistance to the unfamiliar?
Yeah, that's a great point. The legitimate pushback and the more obvious pushback in some ways is easier to deal with because it's so obvious, right? You've
Right.
got, Patty, who's been with the company or with the organization for a long time, and she's just openly resistant to the project. In some ways, that's easier because at least you know where she stands, right? You're not trying to
Right.
guess, you're not trying to speculate on what's really going on underneath the surface. So I think that's the key. But I think if you can get, the problem is that most people don't openly resist change. It's usually below the surface because they don't want to be. Most people want to be team players. Most people want the organization to succeed. Most people want what's best for the organization. So in some ways that's good news, but it's also bad news as change management people because it's harder to detect. So the sooner you can sort of detect that and understand it and just recognize it and be okay with it, just know that there's going to be resistance. We can't have it go on forever, but we know there's going to be resistance and we just know we need to address it. It's just more, I think if you depersonalize it a little bit, that makes it easier in some ways. I don't know if I answered your question. In fact, I don't even remember what your question was now.
No, that's great. That's great.
Oh man. Okay. Eric, my question, I've always sort of thought about this. What is the importance of theoretical or academic models for change management? You've got ADKAR and ProSci and all of those. Are those practically applicable?
Yeah, they can be. I think, I think that what's great about ADKAR and some of these other academic models and structures and frameworks for change management is that they didn't exist, decades ago. And so it's good
Mm,
to have those in place now. When I started my career, that stuff didn't really exist. So you're sort of
yeah,
shooting in the dark and guessing and trial and error with change management. So now you've got some good frameworks and proven tool sets out there. But I think the problem I see with a lot of change management programs is sort of a one size fits all approach where you're just taking sort of a scattershot approach of I'm just going to do all this stuff that I know I should do as a change management person. I've got this toolbox and I'm going to use every tool in my toolbox. When the reality of change in these sorts of transformations is a couple things. One is they don't always apply. They're not always going to be effective in a given situation or organization. But also a lot of times there just isn't the bandwidth and capacity to do all that stuff.
right.
So a lot of times you end up having to choose, what are those most effective and the highest ROI sorts of activities from a change perspective that are going to have the biggest impact on the organization. So I think they're good, but I think too often organizations have sort of a one size fits all or all
Yeah.
or nothing approach to those frameworks.
Yeah, we get those questions a lot as we pitch to government agencies. What's your methodology for change management? And is there a right answer? Without saying it depends, we tell them we're familiar with all of these academic models, but what really works in our experience for our clientele is just treating people like people.
Mm,
Number one, right? And being the champions of change ourselves becomes the most important job in a large scale implementation. You pick the right, and through our methodologies, right, you pick the right vendors, you have the PMO in place, and all of those things make sure that the widgets are being produced, but the people that need to get with the program and change and have their daily life changed are the most important. And if they're not along, then the executives look bad, and this whole thing is falling apart. um, so again, the ghosts of resistance can be invisible and right in front of you at the same time. So we have an audience question. Mackenzie says, obviously this is situational. We need to use that. Doesn't that mean it depends? Obviously this is
Yeah, I think
situational.
so. It's just another way of saying it. Yeah,
Teacher,
absolutely.
but what are the most significant risks if the resistance is not addressed?
Well, I think at the best case scenario, the best thing that'll come of not addressing resistance is that you just don't get the business value and the results you expected post implementation after you've deployed software. That's sort of the best case scenario that could possibly play out. And what I mean by that is usually it's worse than that. Usually it's you don't get to go live, or the go live is a complete disaster because your people aren't on board and they don't fully embrace and they're not supportive of the change. And so it turns into a top down, let's force it down their throat
Yeah.
sort of a initiative versus a, hey, we buy into this and we're all on board with it sort of a thing.
Well, there's a flip side to that, right? I was in a meeting yesterday with a city CFO that has had a horrible time with their ERP implementation. And the interesting part is I went through this line of questioning on well, you probably had no change management, no PMO, no. They did all the things right. The vendor didn't come through, and they ran into issues with the system not doing what it was promised to do. And what the CFO said to me is, I lost credibility, the
Mm,
process lost credibility, and we all look bad because we did the right things, but the vendor didn't. How far and how much is the vendor responsible for the client's change management, and on their own side, how do they make sure that they're meeting the same urgency and uh, right, the speed of the client? Because that's what happened here.
yeah, that's it's a great point. I think, first of all, I don't think that most vendors and technical implementers are going to be good at change management. They may say they can do it, but typically they're not good at it. That's not what they focus on. That's not what their core competency is. So rather than trying to fight that and try to force them to do something they're not good at, you just take a step back and say, okay, how are we going to address this need we have? Vendor's probably not the best party to do it. Let's let them focus on what they're good at. And now let's figure out how to address the change management piece, which is why, most project teams will have some sort of dedicated or focused change team that is focused on that. But having said that, you bring up another really good point in that a lot of what decisions are made during a project end up having a material impact on the level of resistance to change, even though you're not even talking about change management or dealing with change management. You're making decisions. For example, a software vendor might say, hey, we've already fully tested the solution. We don't need 3 rounds of user acceptance testing. Let's just cut that down to 1 just so we can hit our go live date. Let's just take that as an example. And that happens often. Let's cut something that seems like has nothing to do with change management. Seems like it will help speed up the project. But decisions like that can derail your change efforts because now your team's not bought in. Now you're uncovering all these problems in 1 round of user acceptance testing with uncertainty of how it's going to get addressed in time for go live. And I'm just giving you one example here, but it's sort of these decisions that are bad decisions in a project that you just shouldn't make in general end up having sort of a domino effect on the change management side of things, where not only having some project management and project governance issues, but now you've got some change management issues because people are doubting the process. They're doubting the solution, as they should in their defense. I mean, oftentimes there's a reason why people are resisting the change. It's because the system's not working the way it should, or it hasn't been fully tested, or they're not comfortable with it. And the vendor oftentimes will say, well, let's just, in the spirit of agile or in the spirit of hitting at a deadline or whatever, let's just plow forward and be aggressive. And you have to take a step back and say, well, hold on, this is our project. Vendor saying we should do whatever doesn't mean that's the right answer for us. Let's decide what the right answer is for us and make sure, we're addressing those sorts of things. So I think you have to look at the whole program and understand how those decisions affect change management and resistance to change and create those ghosts that you're talking about.
And the ghosts show up early, right? We had, you need to make sure you define all of these before you even sign a contract with a vendor. We saved, I'll pat my team on the back. We saved a large police department a couple of days ago from signing a contract that they shouldn't even have been looking at. The vendor said, we will go live and then we'll do data conversion and training and process design. Now, think about what that means. That means their SaaS fees start kicking in, their implementation team starts going away, and now the vendor's left with a product. Yes, it's live, but does it work for you? And change management from that standpoint also is one of the people that were making this decision said, I don't see why this RMS system, records management system, will take 9 months to implement. It shouldn't take more than 3 months in a large police department. I'm like, yeah, you'll have the system. Do your people know that you're making this change? And how does the patrolman change their way of doing business from today's RMS to this modern thing? That's what takes time. So change management needs to be defined at the very top levels.
It's good point. I mean, whenever we get a vendor proposal on behalf of our clients or when we're working with our clients, we always, you inevitably you have to add a grain of salt to it, right? It's sort of, that's the best case utopia scenario that rarely, if ever, happens. And that's just focused on the technology deployment. So if your project is more than a technology deployment, you're trying to change your business, you're trying to get value out of it, you're trying to get people to use it the way it should be used, then chances are you're probably going to have to extend the timeline, add more resources, add more tasks to it, not because you want to overcomplicate things or take longer than you should, but because you want to do it right and you need to add those things to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Going along with the theme, I want to talk about those who may be haunted by these tragedies of software vendors who make broken promises and, have failed implementations. How do you engage with the stakeholders who have been burned by poor change management, and how do you gain their trust back?
Great question.
It's a really good question. And I think the key is to help them understand why those change management lapses or failures happened. What was the cause of it, and help them understand not only the external causes, which many of them are vendor driven and technology disruption driven, but oftentimes it's internally inflicted, self-inflicted. So it's oftentimes our culture. It's not good or bad. It's just our culture is very risk adverse, and we're trying to do a really aggressive timeline. And there's a disconnect there that creates resistance to change. So you just have to be, again, I think the key is to depersonalize it, because it's really easy to take this stuff personally, or too personally, and say, oh, Megan's not supporting the project. And, rather than getting mad at Megan or being upset with Megan for not being more supportive, let's understand, why is it? There's probably a really good reason why she's resisting. And maybe we should know what that is, because there might be something we're missing as a leadership team or as a project team. So I think that's one of the keys is just recognize it's there, know that the ghosts are there, believe in ghosts, and know that the ghost
Right.
exists. And that's the first thing, because so many people don't believe in ghosts, right? To use
Yeah.
that analogy, they
Right.
think it just doesn't exist. The change resistance doesn't exist, and then the ghosts haunt them for years to come after the implementation.
Yeah. And that's a good question, Megan. And it's hard to do. If
Mhm.
someone's lost, like the CFO I talked to yesterday, she's lost faith in the whole process. We did everything right, and here we are haunted. What are you going to do? You got, it's almost like an exorcism. You need to take it out of them, show them a new world, and say that there's good things out there in the world. Um,
This
Tyler's asking a
conversation's
question.
getting super creepy here.
I know, man.
The
That's the point.
exorcisms and
Yeah.
everything.
Speaking of ghosts, here's Tyler.
Yeah.
Tyler says, I assume in the public sector with very strict budgets, change strategies can often be the first initiative cut. Is that what you guys see? How does that affect the success rate? Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things when you propose a project for a, you know, county government or school district. Thankfully, most people know what change management is. They see the line item if you break it out like that, and when it comes down to cutting the budget down or timeline down, that tends to be the first thing to see. We have a recent client. It's a school district, and we've laid out a very aggressive timeline per their request, and the superintendent calls us and says, how can we cut this down? We don't do we really need to do process reviews? Do we really need to do change management and visioning sessions? And do we really? Yes. I mean, from a practitioner's perspective, we really need to do it. It probably is the most important thing to do. So it doesn't come down to the budget. And I'll tell you, the perception of the public sector is the budgets are tight, but these are critical things that we recommend they think of them as building a new police station or a school building or a hospital. This isn't just a software development or an upgrade or a purchase project that they can just hand to the IT person and say goodbye. If they start thinking about these things as a large scale public housing development, and the risks associated with those projects are the same that are with an ERP implementation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, Kyler brings up a good point too, in that, a lot of these ghosts originate from, just unrealistic expectations. You have this vision, or you've been sold this utopia project plan of a 12-month deployment or whatever it is, when all along it was never going to be 12 months. It was always going to be 18 or 24 months. And so to Kyler's point, you end up cutting stuff to try and force fit your project into a timeline that was never realistic. The budget was never realistic. Right. But yet then you start making these bad decisions of cutting things like change management, which ends up haunting you more later.
And Sage has been known to banish ghosts temporarily. So they'll always
but
come
not
back.
Permanently.
No.
You got to get to the root cause.
Public sector case study or big failure that haunts you. Gosh, we've never been part of a failure. Not on our
They've been
behalf.
Perfect.
Yes. No, I mean, how do you define success and failure, right? One of these things we talk about quite a bit is, what does success mean to you? What does go live mean to you? And if it's not the client's definition of those things, then of course, by definition, it's failure. If you take the vendor's definition of what go live means to you, what date you're going to go live, and therefore define success, that isn't quite what we profess. But a big failure that haunts you, I think it's a failure and a success in the same breath, because we had a client. It's a large council of governments in Arizona that we were trying to help implement an ERP system. Turns out the vendor lied on their requirements definition response and the RFP on this one particular process that they really wanted this new vendor to take on, because they were doing it on spreadsheets and 7 or 8 steps. Turns out with the new product, it was going to take 13 steps because of how that product couldn't do those things. So not quite change management, but really a testimony to the process that both firms profess to, is really make sure that the requirements are documented, that you have great PMO and documentation, so that when this ghost shows up and says, no, your requirements suck, our product can do it all, you don't know what you want, we can show them these, I don't know, I can't come up with a new good analogy, but really it's like holy water, right? Throw it on those ghosts and they went away. We were able to get them out of this really bad contract that they would be stuck with. And when in that situation, the client only has three possible options. One is stick with a bad product. Second, go back to your board and say we made a mistake. And third, blow the whole thing up and do an RFP again, at least in the public sector. Eric, what are your case studies of big failures that you've been experienced?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you learn. I feel like we learn so much from the projects that have already failed, and then they ask us to come clean it up. I mean, you just learn a lot about transformations in that. I mean, it's one thing to do it right and to guide a client the best you can, based on experience, but having that failure experience is actually super helpful in our case to kind of understand how these risks happen. But the thing is it's not usually one thing. Like I'd love to say that there's like 99% of the time it's this one thing that causes failure. It's usually a series of things. I could give you like 5 things that are commonly a cause. One is what you mentioned, not having clear business requirements. Change management or a lack of focus on change management is another that's commonly there. Having an unrealistic plan and budget up front is another reason. And then just not having a vision of like what you want to be when you grow up. That's right. A recipe for failure. And also, a lot of the biggest failures we've seen are ones that really had nothing to do with the project itself. There's just a backdrop and undercurrent of other issues in the organization. So, a company that, for example, that's going through a big merger or acquisition or has political tensions internally, more so than most organizations, or it's just sort of a toxic culture. And sometimes organizations like that have bigger fish to fry. They should be focused on fixing their businesses, not going through digital transformation, but then they end up investing all this money in digital transformation that ends up going nowhere, not because the project is necessarily run poorly, but because they're just not going to succeed because of other internal issues or lack of resources or that sort of thing. So there's a whole string of things that can cause failure. And the key is to sort of play whack-a-mole. If you guys remember the whack-a-mole arcade game, there's always risks all over the place. You just got to keep hitting the moles and they're going to keep popping up in new places. And you've got to be there and ready with a little squishy hammer thing to pop them back down.
You mean whack-a-go?
Speaking of internal issues, how do you all ensure like complete transparency and change management to prevent maybe those who are sharing ghost stories or rumors about the project, right? You always have that one person or maybe several people who are going around telling ghost stories about how this isn't going to work and that's not going to work. How do you guys prevent that from happening, or how would a consultant prevent that from happening?
Well, the key is to over communicate. I mean, it's sort of like you have to look to sociology and understand why rumors start. And rumors typically start in the absence of information, and people create their own answers and they try to connect the dots of things in incorrect ways or inaccurate ways. So the way to counter that, one of the best ways is just to be transparent, like Avi was mentioning a minute ago, just to have that hyper transparency and the over communication. I can't tell you how many times we work with clients that'll say, oh, we already communicated that, or we already sent an email about that. Well, yeah, but half your team doesn't read emails. So, and they're not going to, and the half that did read it, maybe half of them sort of remember what the email said. So right there, 75% of your staff didn't get the message. And you also take a play from the marketing, common marketing playbooks that people have to hear a message 7 times before they get it. And so you just have to be over redundant. I mean, a lot of times project team members are so ingrained in the project. They know so much about what's going on day to day and all these different details that they forget that the rest of the organization is totally detached from what they're doing day to day. And they don't understand things in the same way they do. So I think just that over communication is probably the number one thing.
Yeah. And we actually promise that to our clients, right? In pitch meetings, like you'll hear from us until you tell us it's too much. And even then you'll hear from us. Because it's important. You're right, Eric. People don't read emails, so we've now started doing video updates and just send them out on a blast. We can see if people are watching them or not, and report back to the executives on the level of engagement. It's one of the things we do, not just video, but we're doing newsletters and email blasts, whatever it takes to be upfront and visible to the user community.
Right.
Mackenzie's question, I think, is worth digging into. Where'd she go? What's How do change management and project management intersect, and where do they differ? And Kyler's got a similar project question: who's responsible for OCM in a project? So let me take that. I think change management is a big part of the project management office. In larger projects, you have to have a very defined lead on change management that does nothing but change management. It can take different forms, right? I can't stress enough that over communication is one of the tactics. The others come from academic, programs like ADCAR and ProSci. But at the very least, treat people like people and understand that you're changing people's lives when they don't necessarily want you to do that. It's inefficient. The processes are inefficient to you, the consultant, and to the executive, but the people that are, the person that's been doing purchase orders the same way for 20 years thinks everything's great and don't see why you want to change this. So PMO includes change management and OCM, and definitely for much larger projects.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd agree with that. And I think, one thing I'd add too is that some of the most effective change management team members that I've ever seen are the ones that they understand change management pretty well, but they aren't so specialized in change management that they don't understand operations or project management. I think the best change management people are the ones that really can dig into a business process and understand how a process is changing, or understand, operationally what the company is doing. Too often change management people, and this is a pretty broad generalization that isn't true for everyone, but it's common, is that a lot of times change management people are sort of in the ivory tower. They've got their ADCAR model up here, and they're gonna swoop down and do all this magical fairy dust stuff from a change perspective. And the reality is, you've got to get down in the muck as a change management person. You've got to understand the processes and the reengineering and the way technology is being deployed. And the better you can do that, the more you can relate to the people and what change they're going through, and you can sort of tailor the change management and the messaging around that.
Yeah, and this is why I love the process of business process mapping, right? Because that's when you are talking to these ghosts of resistance that are like, I don't want to change. I don't care what system you bring in. I'm going to keep my spreadsheet. I'm going to keep this database that IT guy or gal built for me, especially. But when you sit through a business process redesign process and you show them the maps and, as is processes and how much wastage there is, or that three people are doing the same process three different ways, visually showing people how taking away these boxes and automating your process will change your life for the better. You won't have to do these things, right? And client education also happens at the same time, because they don't know what's out there or how things are automated in 2023, what AI is. Conceptually, they can't fathom that a process that takes 140 steps can now be done in 10 because of automation.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Kyler says, can you talk about the importance of using user adoption strategies? I assume that frontline user adoption is critical to project success in the public sector. I'd say any sector, right, Eric? It's people that will be using the system.
Yeah, for sure. It starts with what you just said about business processes. It starts with that, making sure people understand what the new business processes are going to be, and sort of roles and responsibilities and expectations within those processes. And then you layer on top of that the how, how do we do this in the new system? And that's where you can use learning and adoption tools and training, online training and classroom training and all different types of ways to teach people how those technologies are going to work. But I think too often organizations start at the top and say, okay, let's teach people how to use technology, versus let's first make sure they understand the foundation of the business processes and what their role is in those processes. Let them freak out and panic and do all the stuff they're going to do, which is normal human behavior. And then once you've gotten past that, then you start to do the sort of the traditional technology training and the process training on top of that.
Yeah. See, the other thing with business process redesign is those sessions make people be seen, right?
Mm,
You're bringing out the ghost from the background. You're talking about change. You're spending extended time with people resistant to change at any level in the organization. You might find naysayers, but I've found that sustained process redesign activities that take, you create a map, you talk through it, you give it to them, validate it, they come back with more ideas than they had in the first meeting. And that ties into Kyler's question: is how do you use organizational assessments in documenting processes? I think it's all tied together. You could do an organizational assessment just by asking interview questions, but when you dig into business processes, in my experience of 20 years, that's when people really start opening up and telling you what's really going on, right? Why does this process take 7 steps? Well, because this spreadsheet I made 7 years ago is the only way to track this one little detail
hmm
in the whole process. Now it's taking her or him all day to do this thing. Now you're opening the door to the conversation of, well, if you go to an automated system, here's what's out there. You don't even need the spreadsheet. This happens when you sleep. You don't have to do this. But then you open up more can of worms, right? What's going to happen to my job, and how's the organization going to do without me? So,
Yeah,
um,
exactly. Yeah, that key part you just said at the end is a big one, which is, the organization's so dependent on me now because I have the spreadsheet that with the 7 steps to track this one piece of information, and I'm the only one that really knows how to do that.
yeah,
Now all of a sudden, everyone's going to know how to do it. The technology is going to automate it. What does that mean for me? Am I still going to be valuable to the organization? And you have to sort
yeah.
of build that future state vision of what that person's role is going to be and how it's probably going to be even more important in the future. But at
Mhm.
that moment in time, they're doubting that they're going to be important. So I think that's important.
Yeah. And tribal knowledge is critical, right? These people that are bogged down by manual processes, they're extremely valuable in a strategic sense, right?
Mhm.
If you're an executive, you would love to tap into the tribal knowledge of someone that's been doing the same thing inefficiently. 20 years ago, that would have been at the time the best process they could do. They were using Excel. They've gone from typewriters and um, paper and pencil, and they have a lot of knowledge that's very important to the project and to the organization. Uh, so Kyler's question is: you mentioned traditional manual processes. How do you address this tribal knowledge and ensure these tenured employees transition effectively? Eric, to your point, you transition them to more strategic roles. I've yet to see an organization. Of course, I work in the public sector. Letting people go or layoffs are not a thing that happens. So you could do. I've seen organizations do one of two things: reassign um, resources to other projects or departments that need resources, or these people become very strategic advisors to the entire organization.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And most, I'd say even in the private sector too, it's the same thing. I mean, most organizations that invest in technology in these big ERP implementations are doing so because either they're growing quickly or they want to be growing and they want to
Mhm.
scale for growth. So with that growth mindset, they're not thinking about necessarily cutting people. They're thinking about how could we maybe hire less people going forward? How could we keep the same team intact and grow 20% or whatever, handle 20% more work with the same amount of people. That's more what most organizations are thinking. But to your point, if I'm an employee, I don't necessarily know that. Or, I may not be, if I'm in the public sector, maybe I'm not as worried about quote unquote losing my job, as in terms of being laid off or just completely losing my job. But I might be concerned about quote unquote losing my job in the way I know it today. And that's in many ways just as big of a threat to a person individually than, completely losing their job.
Yeah. Audience question: what do you see as the leadership's role in change-friendly environments? I would assume that's executive leadership
And what is their role in what in the
in
change?
in fostering a change-friendly environment in the organization.
It's a good question. Just more, just creating a culture of change
Yeah.
versus actually forcing in the change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is certainly practice. I mean, the more you go through change and you successfully navigate those changes as an organization, the more confident people and the culture becomes
Mm-hmm.
in the change. So that's the first thing. And that's why a lot of times, companies that just haven't changed much in 10 or 20 years, now all of a sudden they want to deploy AI and, really cool
Yeah.
technologies.
4.0.
Yeah, whatever it is, trend 4.0, whatever it is. Um, that's a big change for them, and they're not used to change. So to create that culture of change, or to create a change friendly environment, maybe you do more incremental changes to sort of, walk before you run, and start to incrementally, work through some changes, and then work your way up to a big transformation over time. But I think the biggest thing is just practicing, and not trying to overdo it, and not trying to force it, in a culture that maybe just isn't used to it.
And I think in smaller organizations, it's important to see change as positive. It's not necessarily a bad thing because it's iterative, right? As small business owners that have started on their own from ground zero, you know how that goes. You put things out there, you iterate, and you change, and you're nimble. That I see as a positive. But in a larger organization, constant change may lead to some frustration.
Yeah. It's very, very true.
Kyler.
So, Kyler beat me. Go ahead.
No worries. What are your top change management resources that you learned from?
You want me to answer that?
Yeah.
I read a lot. I watch a lot of videos too. So I actually watch and try to learn from peers as much as I can, like from you and from others in the industry. I just try to learn in that way. I think a lot of the learning, I'm finding a lot of the learning, the further I get in my career, is more on the job, I'd say, and less academic, or less, something I read in a book. But I enjoy learning from other people and just sort of sharing battle stories. I think that's probably the best way.
Same here. And that's what happens when we get together. It's just battle stories.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And then we end up battling each other.
Same here. Just reading, hanging out with peers, and watching what's going on in the industry. And, a deep interest in people. What makes people tick? What are the hot buttons? And it's different. That's what keeps it exciting. In different industries, different regions of this country, you can't use the same tactics. So it's not the same everywhere.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. So personal phantoms. Were there moments in your all's careers when you had to confront your own ghost of resistance, and how did you navigate those?
Ooh.
Ooh.
We got lots of examples, lots of things I could.
There's skeletons of ghosts, many everywhere.
I wish I had a mic to just drop it and leave. Mic drop.
Personal ghost. I'm not going to tell personal ghost stories, but professional ghost stories, like growing up in this industry, consulting is a hard profession, and it changes you profoundly. And being in this industry, I mean, Eric's got more longevity than I do. We've changed. I've changed as a person from the day I walked into my first consulting job. Number one, I realized I didn't know anything. And second, the constant, if you worked at a consulting firm, that no 2 days are the same. So what defines change is how you grow within the industry and pick up new strategies, tools, and skill sets to 20 years later be on a show like this with Eric.
Yeah.
You're slaying goats every day. Sorry, go ahead.
It's interesting you say that consulting is hard, because I totally agree. And I always think if someone is in consulting and they don't think it's difficult, then they're probably not very good at it. Because I think if you're good at it, if you're doing your job right, it should be difficult. It should be pretty hard. But I think mine is probably like when I left the last company that I started, that was by far the most difficult change that I had to go through. And I resisted it intensely. Just, when I left that company to start Third Stage, it was my wife that ultimately encouraged me for years to do it. And finally it got to the point where there's sort of like a breaking point. And she was like, all right, it was almost like an intervention. Like, you need to do this like right now. This is insanity. And, it's sort of like a come to Jesus sort of moment. But, that was a difficult change for me. But a lot of times, that's that's sort of a hammer approach to change, in the case of, my wife's and my relationship. But, sometimes you do need to bring out the hammer, when you're going through change. I know we've talked a lot in this conversation about like how to ease into it and how to empathize, all important stuff. But there are times where you've got to get the hammer out and just say, look, AV, you've been resisting this now for 6 months. We're not really asking you. We're telling you the change is going to happen, and this is what we're doing. But that's sort of a last resort when someone's
drastic
really
moves, as I call it. We've tried all these tweaks. Let's bring the hammer down.
Yeah.
Here's a chance for us to pat our own backs a little bit, Eric. As two CEOs on the Inc. 5,000 fastest growing company list, 3 years in a row for us.
Only 2 for us. You got us. Is that what you're trying to say? 3 to 2.
You'll catch up. How do you address big change / resistance in a high growth environment? It's hard. It's hard because it's constant. Again, it's not a bad thing. We're tweaking to get better every day. So we try not to get to a point where it's drastic change and the hammer needs to be brought down. But the communication within our own companies needs to be clear, and over communication and things that we tell our clients need to happen internally about incremental change and automation and just growing up at the same time. I make that distinction also because growth in itself is not sustainable unless you build the foundations within the organization. And as small business owners and in 5,000 awardees, that's foremost on my mind. What about you, Eric?
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson I have from high growth is actually something I learned from 2 different outside advisors I've had over the years. And that is, what gets you to a certain point of growth, it worked really well.
Mm-hmm.
It may not work for the next iteration of growth. So like in our case, we had a lot of trouble getting past $5 million in revenue. That seemed to be like this thing we were just stuck at. Mm-hmm. And, we had to rethink our processes and how we did things and all kinds of stuff. And then we sort of, we finally blew through that, and you get to 10 million. And then you start thinking, okay, getting past 10 million, it's just different. It's a different set of processes, a different set of strategies and that sort of thing. You can stay true to who you are and, keep certain things consistent as an organization, like your values and your culture and all that stuff. But operationally, you end up having to change, the things that get you to one spot aren't the same things that are going to get you to the next milestone in growth after that.
Yeah, that's a great point. You hit walls in certain directions on a daily basis, and you realize it's not necessarily that you're doing things wrong. This isn't going to work anymore.
Yeah,
and that's when you need to take some drastic action and change things around, bringing in new people, new technology, new processes, and we learn as we go.
Yeah, absolutely.
No one's born to do this. I don't think it's all learnable, teachable.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, Eric, thank you for joining us today. If there's no more questions, Megan, we will let Eric get on with his life. And Eric, thank you for joining us. I know Kyler's put some links in the comments here to your book, to your YouTube channel. And again, I enjoy this partnership and friendship quite a bit, and look forward to more, Eric.
Yeah, likewise. Appreciate you guys having me on, and I always enjoy chatting with you guys. It's always a good time. So
let's go slay some ghosts.
Yeah, let's do it.
That's right.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Right. Thanks. Guys. Have a great week.
You too.